Hello and welcome everyone. We will just get started in just a few minutes, but thank you so much for joining. Please feel free to also put your name and the state you're calling in from in the chat. Would love to welcome you. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Again, we'll just get started in just a few minutes as folks continue to join. Please go ahead and drop your name and place that you're joining from in the chat. Awesome. Seeing some friends in the chat. Welcome everyone. Again, we'll just get started in just a few minutes. We will go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. But in the meantime, please just go ahead and put your name and place that you're joining from in the chat. Awesome. So we have folks from all over. It seems like California, New Jersey, North Carolina, New York, Maryland. Again, some more from North Carolina and New York, Chicago. Fantastic. So we have a very packed agenda for you all. So we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining what is sure to be a super compelling and informative conversation around implementing prison gerrymandering reform. Today, we will hear from Alex Kajura at Prison Policy Initiative on how best to bridge the gap between passing reform and implementation. And then we'll also hear from Maryland Department of Planning Secretary Robert McCord and his staff on Maryland's successful 2010 implementation effort, as well as how they're doing in 2020, especially given the delay in 2020 census data. And then if we time this right, we will have time, about 15 minutes at the end, for audience Q&A. So without further ado, I will introduce Lori Schellenberger, who will be moderating today's discussion and then formally introducing our speakers. Lori is a voting rights and election reform and redistricting expert who consults with state and national organizations working to build a more inclusive democracy. She currently serves as a consultant for Common Cause's national redistricting team, and she was formerly a director of ACLU of California's Voting Rights Project and is a graduate of New York University Law School. So I will hand it over to Lori. Thank you.
Thanks, Keisha. And I just want to start out, welcome everyone, and especially to our speakers who are very busy in the weeds of implementing gerrymandering reform in their states and across the country. The purpose of, I just want to just briefly talk about the purpose of today's webinar, which is really, we invited advocates, stakeholders, legislators, commission, redistricting commission members to understand sort of the and discuss the implementation process for prison gerrymandering reform. It's you hear that term and you may have even been involved in passing reform in your state, but there's a lot of nuance and small differences in the way that states and local municipalities implement reforms or address prison gerrymandering in the absence of a formal policy, because there are still things you can do. And particularly when nearly all states have people housed in federal, state, and local jails, and different reforms address different populations or remain silent about others. And so this webinar isn't about passing reform. There is a webinar this Thursday, July 8th. That's an activist training for those who are trying to fight against prison gerrymandering in their state or local jurisdictions, because there's still a lot you can do even without legislation. And we'll post in the chat a link to that webinar and send something out after today's webinar with a link for that Thursday activist training. But instead today, we really are diving into the weeds of how implementation and and in particular, how the reallocation of people with known addresses works, and also what you can do to mitigate gerrymandering, even in the absence of the ability to reallocate someone to a last known address. And we have two experts who are, as I said, very busy with implementation, and we really appreciate them being with us here today. I'm going to introduce them now, and then we'll hear from both of them. First, Maryland is one of two states that passed comprehensive gerrymandering reform prior to the 2011 redistricting cycle, and then successfully reallocated tens of thousands of people incarcerated in the state's prison system so that they were counted and represented at their home address in the state and congressional maps that have been used by Maryland for this past decade. So we're thrilled to have Robert McCord, the Secretary of Planning for the state of Maryland, who's overseeing that reallocation process again this year. Secretary McCord has been with the Department of Planning since 2015, and he first served as an Assistant Secretary of Operations and a Deputy Secretary. He now provides comprehensive leadership for the department's mission, objectives, and initiatives. He comes to planning with private sector and public experience. He worked in private law practice in Bel Air, Maryland, before joining the Hartford County Law Department in 1998 as county deputy attorney. Then he was county attorney for 10 years. And he's seen issues from Western Maryland to the Eastern Shore as a trustee on the local government insurance trust. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and he holds a degree from Loyola University, Maryland, as well as an MBA in marketing and a JD from University of Baltimore School of Law. And I was thinking as I read his bio that he was Maryland through and through. And then today when we were prepping, he also was holding up a Maryland water cup. So I think that holds true. It's all Maryland all the time. And then he has a few members of his team with him today to help answer questions. And that includes Kanish Sharma, who's the Director of Planning, Data and Research, Alfred Sundara, who's the manager for the department's Projections and State Data Center, and Shelley April, who's the Geospatial Planner. Okay, and we also have Alex Castura, who has been the legal director at the Prison Policy Initiative for the past 12 years. In addition to working on important issues like sentencing enhancement zones and the devastating and often hidden impacts of mass incarceration, Alex has been instrumental in building the Prison Gerrymandering Project, a campaign to end prison gerrymandering nationwide. And under Alex's direction, the project has published extensive state-by-state research on the impact of prison gerrymandering, and they have a bank of resources, including model legislation and guides to ending prison gerrymandering that have been adopted by 11 states and hundreds of counties and local municipalities across the country. So we're going to actually start with Alex today so that she can give an overview of kind of the landscape of prison gerrymandering and reform, how some of these policies are a bit different, and sort of what reallocation process, the purpose and sort of how that works generally, before we turn it over to Secretary McCord to talk about the weeds of how Maryland has implemented. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
There we go. Thanks, Lori. So as Lori mentioned, this is focusing on the states that are implementing reform, mostly through legislation. And there are kind of two exceptions to that. One is states like Montana that are looking to do the reallocation without legislation in place. And states that don't have legislation in place and are looking at other ways to end prison gerrymandering without a full reallocation, which is counting everybody back at home. The states that have passed legislation are New York and Maryland that passed it in time to implement it last decade. So they are already under plans right now that have solved prison gerrymandering. First time this decade are going to be California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Nevada, New Jersey, Virginia, and Washington State. And Illinois has passed legislation that will be first implemented for the 2030 cycle. So they're in a good position to kind of get ahead of the curve. And because as you'll see, there's a lot of prep that can happen that'll make your road easier going into the implementation. And so basically what these laws do is take somebody's home address and map it against compare it to the census data to count everybody back at home, so that when the district lines are drawn, they're drawn based on a census data set that's been adjusted to count everybody at home in broad strokes. And this data, depending on the legislation in your state, will be used at different levels of districts. Sometimes it's city and county districts that are using this data, state legislative districts, so your state assembly, state senate. Some states apply to congressional districts. And the impact is least at the congressional level, just because the number of people per district are so large that it makes the least difference when you count somebody in the wrong spot. At the county and local level, it makes the biggest difference, which is why counties and municipalities have been the leaders on this actually for the past couple of decades, because you can see at that level, when you're making a district, sometimes you'd be drawing a district that would have no actual city residents in it. You know, your town would be divided up into districts and have one or two seats permanently empty on the city council. And so I'll address the towns first, because they're kind of the simplest solution that they've all implemented before these states have taken initiative to make that accessible to them, to make it easier. Basically, the city or county, when they're redistricting the county commissioner districts or the city council districts, will take the correctional population that was counted in their town. And because basically none of the folks incarcerated in that building are from town, sometimes maybe you'll get like a handful of people. The easiest way to address that is to just remove that population from the town population and draw your districts. The downside to doing that, obviously, is if you had people in town that are incarcerated elsewhere in the state, you won't be counting them in their city council district. And for the handful of folks that were incarcerated in that facility, they're now kind of removed from the data set that you're using. The impact of that falls well within usually allowable population deviations. So, you know, if you're basically at that point miscounting maybe a dozen people, which just doesn't make much of a practical impact on the data. Now, for the states that have implemented legislation, what they're doing is they're taking home address data, which they get from the Department of Corrections, usually in the state. The states are divided between whether or not they ask the federal government for federal prisoner data. The Bureau of Prisons has not been cooperative, to the extent that some states in their legislation don't even attempt to ask for that data. Nobody's been given it. And then you have folks who are incarcerated in local jails, which the data tends to be hard to get, tend to be much smaller facilities and located closer to home. So it's less crucial that those folks get reallocated, because the impact, again, is smaller on the state district level, congressional district level. Just by chance of geography, you're likely to be incarcerated in the district you actually live in. if you're in a local jail. So for the state facilities, which is where most of the states are doing that reallocation of counting everybody at home, the process to do that is you take the database from the Department of Corrections, and what that usually looks like, they differ obviously from state to state, is a list of addresses. That'll be like 123 Main Street, some town, state. But the census data you receive from the Census Bureau is all populations by what are called blocks. So they're just these little, you can think of it like in the city, it's like a city block. In rural areas, they're just kind of swaths of land. And just the population broken down by race and ethnicity to some extent. So knowing where that somebody lived at 123 Main Street isn't compatible with that data. So it needs to go through a step called geocoding, which is essentially mapping it. And once you have it on as a point in the map, you then know what block, what census block that point in the map corresponds with. And then from there, you can adjust your census data. Some of the pitfalls here are, you try to map, and they're automated systems for doing, it's kind of called geocoding. You try to map something, the address looks perfectly fine on paper. You try mapping it, it bounces back as unmatchable. There could be several things wrong with it. Like what if somebody said, oh, it's 123 Main Avenue? Well, no, it's 123 Main Street. So that's something that's sometimes fixable. Wrong or missing zip codes. Sometimes street names have changed over time. The databases haven't been updated. Sometimes it's a kind of a mistake that leads you to be out of range of a street. Like if you ever tried finding a spot on Google Maps and you don't know the address of it, but you kind of know where you want to put somebody. And like say, like, if you're trying to find a trailhead parking lot, I do that a lot, where you're like just trying to pick a spot where it'll put that pin where you want it, so that you can give somebody an address. What that depends on is each street is broken out into pieces. So it'll be like 0 through 100, Main Street is over here, 100 through 200 is over here. So if you have somebody at 50, this mapping software, and this is oversimplifying it, but the mapping software will be like, okay, 50 is between 1 and 100, we'll stick it in the middle there. So you have these ranges in the street, but sometimes the address falls outside of that range. So like, what if the street only goes up to 100 and you have somebody saying they're 105? Now, some software is smart enough to be like, okay, well, we'll just stick them at the end of the street. Some software will bounce that back as a not match, like you can't find it. So there's a lot of cleanup of this address data that you can do. And this is really where one of the decision points is of how much time and resources can you, or are you willing to, as a state, devote to cleaning up the data. And at some point, there's just not much more you can do, which is kind of what the problem Nevada's facing at this point. Talking to the geographer that's working there on it, they're going through some like really extreme steps to get some of that data cleaned up. But if you're missing enough of the address, there's just not much else you can do. And beyond those kind of ways in which the addresses you have from the Department of Corrections won't be usable in the end, therefore your data from the Department of Corrections won't match your census data. Sometimes just the Department of Corrections gave the Census Bureau the population data like the day before they gave it to you. So, or the state entity doing the redistricting, the geocoding. So just the total population might not match. And this is now something that is going to be slightly compounded by the differential privacy protections that the Census Bureau is putting in place. So the census has always used some sort of disclosure avoidance systems that keep people's information private. What they're doing this decade is just kind of injecting automated randomized noise into the data so that you won't get the population total. If you had some way of knowing what the reality was on the ground of who they actually counted, the data they publish will be slightly off from what they counted. So this is what California is coming up against right now. The folks doing their redistricting actually took steps. They got the actual data that the Department of Corrections sent to the Census Bureau, so they will know what the total populations the Census Bureau was starting with. Now they're going to get populations back from the Census Bureau that won't match that. I think they're going to be the only ones in the country that are facing a mismatch on that level, whereas everybody else, the Census Bureau has really turned down that noise to a level where your usual discrepancies between the data you have from the Department of Corrections and the Census Bureau are going to overwhelm any discrepancy caused by the differential privacy system. But, you know, it's still going to be like a little bit of noise in there that folks will have to deal with. And, you know, it's just kind of another hassle that need not be there. But that's something to watch for, that people will be a little bit nervous about that, particularly because a year ago when the Census Bureau started putting out test data, it looked really bad. But the thing to know is that has changed since then. The Census Bureau has adjusted a lot of these down. There shouldn't be much of an impact on implementation from the differential privacy system. So the kind of other problems or kind of bigger scope are states like Montana are just late on the ball. They don't have any legislation in place. They're trying to scramble right now to do the redistricting. They're down to a problem of like people who do this kind of adjustment. They're just getting booked up, like redistricting folks with the redistricting coming up. So that's kind of a practical problem that they're facing. Some states don't have the resources to do this in-house. Like most state demographers can do this for you, but I'm sure they're also busy with other things at this point. So a little lead time helps. And the quality of the data coming from the Departments of Corrections varies wildly between states. And this is where really starting now with this redistricting cycle, it's really about getting it as good as you can for now, given what you're starting with. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good right now. And use this cycle as a learning point to make 2030 easier for yourself. And I'm sure, you know, Maryland's in a position right now, having done this once, that they've learned some lessons of ways that they can, because they were really one of the pioneers on this. And so, you know, everybody can learn from Maryland and New York what they did and start off on a better foot for the next redistricting cycle. One of the most important things is really getting your Department of Corrections databases in order, because the better quality you have coming from the Department of Corrections, the easier it makes the rest of the process.
Thanks, Alex. And also, I want to mention Prison Policy Initiative, and Demos published a report on the 2011 process for New York and Maryland that really outlines step by step, and some of the, especially in New York, the steps they were taking to verify addresses. So that's a really helpful resource that folks can find on their website. Okay, I want to turn it over to Secretary McCord now to talk about Maryland and sort of lessons learned and how they're overcoming some of the challenges in doing this work. So Secretary McCord, I turn it over to you and your team. You're still muted. You're on mute.
There you go. Now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Anyway, my team is here with me virtually and in office. I'll have to give credit to the team because they were here last time and I was not. Half the team was here last time. I'm one of the half that was not here last time. But this issue is important to Maryland because, first of all, it's quite simply our law requires it. And whoever does this work, they need to do it right. We do the best job we can to follow the law. And as a lawyer, I want to do that. That's just kind of my nature to begin with. So I have very good people who are doing their best to help follow the law. So this is an issue that we were trying to count everyone in the census. We try to count everyone in the census one time in the right place at the right time. And that's got to last us for 10 years. And this is a similar thing, but we're trying to make sure that we reallocate everybody to the right location because it also has to last for 10 years. So it's not exactly the same, but we want to make sure that this reallocation process, this snapshot we're doing, lasts for 10 years. So we want to make sure that snapshot is good. Try to minimize the number of mistakes as much as possible. We started really as a department before I got here. The department started just after 2010 to talk to the Department of Corrections and figure out what worked well and what didn't work well in the address realm. We really can't tell any particular judge to put a particular address on somebody's form before they get sent to prison, and all the transfers that might happen. We're not part of the judiciary to say we would like this to happen, but Department of Corrections at their intake process to make sure that they're trying to record an address that's a viable address at that time, and try to record data about age and race and ethnicity. So that discussion happened after the 2010 process to make sure that we had as much information as possible. And then, of course, this time around, long before Census Day, we were upgrading and updating the geocoder with the most current data that we had on addresses. And then we had talked probably 2 years ago with the Department of Corrections about the needs that the Department of Planning would have supporting the census effort and then supporting the reallocation effort. So they understood our role in the effort and understood that we didn't really have an interest in putting a particular named person in a particular location. We had to make sure we had attributes of the person as far as their age and their race and ethnicity to be placed in the right place. And we made sure that they understood our goal was to have as many addresses as possible reallocated. So that address cleanup process began, and it depends on staff resources. So supporting the census was an extraordinary effort this time. So the staff was supporting the state complete count committee and every other local complete count committee, sending out at the end of every week the 5 trailing census tracts. So staff was doing prisoner geolocation. That old geocoding process was happening in between other census duties as the census needed extra effort. So I can't easily give an amount of time that it would take to do it because we haven't really had a normal situation. It was either the first time we did it or the second time we did it was because of an extraordinary census effort. So all of the same people supporting the extraordinary census effort also have pieces of doing the prisoner reallocation effort. So that was done in between, little breath of air they could take between supporting the census effort. So I have to give them lots of credit. It's an important process, and I think I mentioned that we have about just around 16,000, just under 16,000 prisoner addresses to process, and we were able to match about over 95.5, let's just call it 96% of those addresses. That's a lot of effort to figure out an address, to make sure the address is correct. And that process could take months to complete. And it was the census process going on at the same time beyond its own deadline. Normally, April 1st, everybody takes that snapshot, the census is over, and that didn't happen this year. But the PO boxes, the incomplete, or the data that was described earlier, the data that's 301 North Main Street when there isn't any 301 North Main Street. South Main Street goes to the 600 block, so it has to be a South Main Street block. So we go through an analysis of each address to try to make sure that we're doing the best we can to reallocate. Even north and south, east, west, Falls Road, Falls Way, Falls Mont, all those variations of Falls that would make sense based on other pieces of information in the address. If the zip code in the address doesn't support Falls Way, but Falls Road, then that would make the decision for Falls Road. That's a simple kind of example. But all of that cleanup and those touch-ups had to be made with an eye to setting XY coordinates and dropping these points down. Ultimately, we work with the Department of Legislative Services because they're our partner in this process to make sure that the vendor that we hire is going to drop these into the census tracts where they need to go. They have to go into the census geographies. So a prisoner from Allegheny County has to be dropped into a Baltimore County census tract, plus the race, age, and ethnicity. So someone from the prison gets dropped on a Main Street somewhere in Baltimore County, and all the attributes of that person are transferred from that location to the next location. And that contractor, by our contract, takes at least, we have a week to turn the information around on the prisoner data, 2 weeks for them to prepare and do their part of the process, and then another week for us to check that process. So we're trying to make sure that if it's done correctly. And it's important from our perspective to follow law as closely as we possibly can. That process is a process that is, it's labor intensive, but we all know the reason that we're doing it. So any kind of questions on the data get run up the chain. So the questions can be run to someone who's doing demography work. The questions can be run to the director of the state data center to figure out what's going on, and then we go back and forth to make sure those corrections are completed. And it's really it's an important process from our standpoint to make sure that it happens in a way that we can stand behind the work. And then when people start to draw maps using the data products that people can use to draw maps, they understand that the work that's been done for the reallocation, it complies with the law. And for our part in Maryland, those reallocation, those adjusted numbers, we call them the adjusted numbers, the adjusted census numbers, are used in the county and municipal process also. So for councilmanic and commissioner districts, we have 3 different forms of government in the 24 counties in Maryland, but each form of government will still use the same adjusted populations. And then the municipalities, there's 157 municipalities in Maryland, and to the extent that they redo their districts also, they would use the same data. And we try to caution them that don't jump on whenever the data comes out. If it's August 16th, it's August 16th. We're still going to have the adjustment process for the prisoner reallocation. And people are wanting to do something right now. And that's this year's quirk, is everybody wants to work with either projected or estimated data. And we remind people that the adjusted data is the best data available. We'll make it available as soon as we possibly can for everyone to do their work at the municipal, the county, and not only that, the state level, because one of our other processes within the Department of Planning is to support the Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission. It's an independent commission, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 3 independents. So that body is supported staff-wise with the technical expertise of the Department of Planning also. So all of that's going on at the same time that we're checking and rechecking the prisoner reallocation. And we got to the point of, let's just call it a 96% match rate on that. And we are trying to make sure that all of that is loaded correctly. So all of the work that we've done will be loaded by the vendor. We will check the vendor's work, and then we will okay that and give our okay to the Department of Legislative Services to say that we agree with everything that's gone on there. But if you back the whole process up, the post-2010 census process is where we begin the process of prisoner reallocation the next time. And then about 2 years out from the actual reallocation, you contact the Department of Correctional Services to make sure they understand our needs again, explain it regardless of staff turnover, regardless of who's in charge, regardless of party affiliation. It's still the process that has to be done so that we make the reach out within those 2 years before we have to do the process. So if there's any cleanup that can be done at their side of the ledger, they can start that process before we're handed data that would be potentially harder to deal with than it would be if they weren't reminded 2 years out. So that's, I guess, the best overview I can give of the process in Maryland.
That's really helpful. Secretary McCord, I want to ask a follow-up question because it's something that you had mentioned in a previous conversation, and it ties to what you were just saying, is that the time that this can take a state is directly tied to the quality of the data that they're receiving from corrections. And so just to give folks a sense of, I know from talking to other states like California, about 60% of the addresses in California could be geocoded easily. It was good data, but there were 40% that required what they were calling manual reallocation, which is that process you just described. And I was curious, can you share that, what the percentages were in Maryland in terms of the quality of the data received?
I could say that we've had, I guess you can classify like out-of-state addresses, incomplete or no address given, PO box or rural routes, which are sometimes difficult to track down. That total is about, it's just under 20%, that just around 19% of those addresses, and that out of state being 9.2 of that. So it's kind of, let's just call it around 10% of that data that is difficult to deal with and may not be actually able to be geocoded. So that's always an issue. And I don't know, like I said, we don't have responsibility at the time of having been in the courtroom to know someone gets a sentence, and then I can't fill out that form on what I'd like to be now, all these years later, what I'd like to make sure it goes on that form when somebody is sent into custody, and make sure we have a good address before they show up at their location. And there are some issues every once in a while with in the prison system. Sometimes they would keep on file an address for someone who is eligible for parole, and then they are trying to put the address for where this person will be located after they leave the prison system. So we have to remind that it's the address at the time they were incarcerated, not the address they may go when they leave the system. So you and I might think of keeping a current address for the purpose of sending out invitations to a wedding, or current address for Christmas cards or something like that. The current address means something different depending upon the level of incarceration, what address they would think is the current address. We have to back up to say we want the address at the time of their incarceration, and we want the address of where this person was. So that's part of our process to make sure that we're getting good addresses. It's of the addresses that we have a match for, the total addresses maybe just about 16,000, and about 15,000, it's 15,257 are the number of addresses that we have matched at that point.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I want to ask, Alex a little bit in states where, I mean, Maryland has this kind of all-star team within and an infrastructure, a really nice infrastructure for implementing this, it seems. And I'm wondering about states that may not have a similar infrastructure in place. What can they, like, can students do this work? When do you need an outside vendor, and what does that look like?
Well,
Yeah, so
yeah.
No, go ahead, Secretary McCord, if you want to respond to that.
No, I'd say ultimately, as far as data cleanup and address cleanup, I'm not sure that what I'm going to say here is that different people doing that, they can maybe divide up sections of addresses. I mean, in Maryland, to say there's 16,000 addresses to deal with, I have no idea what California's number would be. I don't know what a larger state's number would be, but we have the luxury of having a small team that they can bounce things off of and come across common areas and common errors. So if you have a situation where there are lots of addresses, you may have to break it up by region to figure out, what does this region look like? What is the indication for the region for this, where this address would be in a particular region? And ultimately, having this data so that a person actually is deleted from the prison location and appears geographically in the location that they need to be located, plus the race, age, and ethnicity information associated with that person, so that when people are drawing these lines and checking what has been done, that's the reason that we feel the vendor has real value to us, to make sure that happens, and happens in the format that the vendor is making available for redistricting processes, so that we are not responsible for creating something in a format that may not be able to be used somewhere else. And we could tell you how many people, we can tell you how many people what we've done, but in order to make sure that a person is taken from one point and dropped in another point in a map, is a process that has to be done with the vendor that's making that software available for drawing those lines. That's our perspective at this point. I think I appreciate the accolades for we have an all-star staff doing it, because we do. But I think at the end of the day, in order to make it usable, you need to think about who are the end users going to be. And if the end users are going to be drawing lines, can the various and sundry software that's available to do that, in order to be able to incorporate this layer of data and this substitution of data from, you may take 6 points here and drop them in 3 different census tracts here. The other thing that we've made sure is we have disaggregated the names from the addresses and don't make them available. The names are never made available. We have all of the concerns about differential privacy. I think Alex was saying how they're kind of minimized in the sense that in any particular census tract, there's not a lot of people necessarily, but we had the concern that we were not going to make an association between a name and an address so that anybody could find out who this person was returning to a certain census block, so that we understand the concept of differential privacy. We wrote to the census director early on about the first go around of differential privacy, expressed our concerns about the Voting Rights Act possibilities, expressed all of our concerns in a 2-page letter to the director of the census way early on in this process. But differential privacy helps protect the confidentiality of the information, but confidentiality has a different, in one way, a deeper meaning for potentially some incarcerated individuals. There's not just a commercial situation. That big data can find out where I live, and next thing you know, I get spammed with lots of commercial email. But because they figured out I have a small number of people in my census tract, and I'm the person that has 2 children of these ages, and I'm the person here, they put other data on top of it to figure out who I am. People figuring out the name of a person who was incarcerated has potential ramifications from the public safety side for people who would do retaliation and not commercial activity. So that's one of the reasons why we disassociate the names, to make sure that the addresses are important and their attributes are important, but a particular name returning to a particular point on a map is something that we don't want to be part of. Targeting somebody for a bunch of flyers about do they want to buy the latest and greatest thing is different than targeting someone for this person just is being put back here, and we're giving information to people when we put a name that other people may not have known. So we've tried to make sure we work closely with the addresses to make sure they happen and the attributes that associated with that name, but not the name itself. I hope that makes sense to you.
Definitely appreciate you. It's a really important point to make, and appreciate you explaining it so well too. As well as sort of this question about how to divvy up this work and when you can outsource it. And I want to let Alex talk about that too, sort of how other states might be handling just the workload.
Yeah, those are all really great points. The only thing I would add is kind of because Maryland is right now kind of the top performer in this space, what would the other side look like? What's kind of the minimum that one could do? And that's basically, there are 2 parts of this process. One is geocoding the addresses, and the second is making them compatible with that data, the PL data that is in the end. Everybody nowadays is redistricting on software. Like I've seen some counties redistrict on paper, but these are like really small rural counties with like 1,000 people population. So having the data be processable by the software is key. On the geocoding side, like the secretary mentioned, in geocoding, so much of the process depends on these kind of connections between the data that you do see the same types of mistakes. Like all of a sudden you kind of notice like, oh, all these addresses in this cluster like the problem with them all is that the name of this island is known different locally. So it's those sorts of things where it's the more you break it up between different people, the less you lose that, the more you lose that kind of knowledge and ability to make connections, and the worse off your whole process is going to be. And again, the more people have access to the data, the greater the privacy concerns are going to be. Because the data in the end is only made public at the block level. Once it's all adjusted, aggregated to block, giving out single addresses to people definitely has privacy concerns. So at a minimum, what you can do is take your data from the Department of Corrections with no adjustments. Take it as it is, drop it into the Census Bureau's geocoder, which will map it against, I think, their master address file. It's, from what I've heard, it has less flexibility than some of the geocoders available in the other softwares out there, but it's free. The Census Bureau will work with your state to get, even if you have over 10,000 addresses, which is their usual limit, they've made an exception for states doing the sort of reallocation. You can drop it through their geocoder. They'll ping it all back to you, whatever matched with the block numbers, whatever didn't match will just come back as unmatchable, and that's that. And that's kind of the minimum that a state can do to get somewhere in 2020, and then really put in that work starting now for 2030 to make sure Department of Corrections, as long as they start recording addresses on intake now, by 2030 they'll have nearly a complete list. You can designate, what kind of work with the Department of Corrections to see what kind of address formatting would work best with the geocoders. What race and ethnicity data you want to collect. A lot of time, Departments of Corrections collect race and ethnicity data that is completely different from the categories used by the Census Bureau. So that when doing that adjustment, you have to then kind of make a best guess fit into the census data. If you're collecting the addresses from the get-go, knowing that this is going to be a use for them later, you can collect the data in a format that's more compatible with the Census Bureau race and ethnicity categories. Yeah, so that's kind of the minimum that you can do. And yeah, the maximum is, go through every single address, have a couple people spend a day or two on each address, and you can map anything. But
yeah. Thanks, Alex. And we have a question from the audience regarding the timeline for state. It was a more general question about the timeline for state versus federal, in terms of what to do with those populations. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about sort of the dilemma when you're required by law to reallocate folks in federal prisons, but you don't have that address data, and how you handle that issue, how that issue gets addressed in states.
I can start off on that. In one way, it comes down to percentages. If we determine that the number of federal prisoners is kind of like 1%, 1.1% of the total that we're dealing with generally, and we've made the request. We've made the appeals of the request and the internal process for the public for the FOIA appeal and been denied. So I wanted to be on record having first of all made the request and then made the request through the appeal process, and then in consultation with the Attorney General's office and the Attorney General, the Senior Attorney General assigned to my department to make the determination whether we could start a litigation process that would result in something that would be actually resolved by the time that we had to do the work. And so it was for 1.1% of the addresses, we would stay focused on doing our best job with the state prisoners and forego continuing the process in the federal side of litigating the issue. And of course, in a year where everything else is up in the air with the census, and the census being having its challenges in courts all across the country. I've read more deposition testimony from census officials than I care to think about, because I go to the Alabama case, I go to the case in New York, go to the cases and see what they're saying throughout the entire process of the census and all the challenges. So, and we're reacting to California court rulings here on the East Coast that me, the lawyer, stays up until 3 or 4 in the morning reading through, so I'm able to explain it to the state CCC the next morning about what just happened. So there was a lot going on this particular year, and if that wasn't going on, would we have more time to focus on kind of cracking the nut on the federal prisoner reallocation? And the answer was we might have had more time, but litigating that issue took a back seat to making sure that what we could do well. At the same time, we were trying to keep ourselves on our target of being in the top 10 or self-response rates in the country. So coming in number 9 in the country for self-response rate justifies the efforts of the team that we have to supply the information to the locals to focus their efforts. And then as everybody shifted to COVID. So it was not a fight I was willing to take this year. That's the shortest answer to that.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. We have, and California's independent commission is struggling with this right now. It's different from state to state. I know in Maryland, if you can't reallocate, you count them where they're housed.
Right.
Other states have more discretion to remove, if they can't reallocate, to nonetheless solve the one half of the gerrymandering problem and remove those folks from the count for those districts. Alex, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the just, that varies state to state, and I think New York requires that they be removed.
Yeah, so the states, for basically in most states, the federal prison population gets looped into any other address that can't be reallocated, either because like the folks who are in federal custody don't have an address to start with, or if going through all the steps of the geocoding manual adjustments, the address was nevertheless unable to be geocoded. And so, yeah, the states differ between what to do with folks for whom you have no other address. Some states like Maryland will count them at the location of the facility. The other states will basically count people at large, so they'll be counted toward the state population, but not toward any specific district. Like Lori said, it solves the problem of giving districts that have prison facilities in them unwarranted representation, but it doesn't solve the problem of communities that are missing loved ones in prisons from getting their representation back. And yeah, you have some states that it's that I believe it's not specified in the statute. So right now, that's part of the problem. Like if you don't have everything spelled out ahead of time, you're in the middle of this process trying to make decisions where you're not sure, what's going to pull what thread, and they end up being outcome determinative in some cases, where you're asking basically technical staff to make decisions that are more have policy implications.
One thing that's come up, and this is in Colorado, and we have someone from Colorado asking this question because it'd be interesting to hear if it was an issue in Maryland, is this concern that you would like a reallocation could result in negative census block population. And I'm wondering if that could be just because generally of the data being off in terms of what you get from corrections, but also because of the differential privacy. Has that been an issue that you've seen where you have a census block with negative population that resulted from reallocation?
I'm not aware that we've ever had the situation of a negative census block because of reallocation. And I can just get Shelley, if you've seen that in the past, you can please let us know right now.
Yes, we did see that in the last redistricting process. We had only one block that turned out to be a negative number, and that was just because of how the Census Bureau allocated the prisoners. Particular institution spanned 2 blocks, so they split the population up.
Yeah.
So we ended up with one block with a negative number, but we ultimately decided to zero that one out because it was only off by, I believe it was like 3. So it wasn't a huge impact.
But the institution itself spanned over 2 census blocks, is what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Yes.
Okay.
And are there, I know there are special tabulations this decade that there weren't last time in terms of providing more detail about where the group quarters are at the census block level. Can that help fix that? Will that help address that issue?
My initial answer is I'll believe it when I see it, or I don't know if it's going to address the issue without seeing how that comes out. But the more detail, the better in one hand, but I don't know if it's going to address the problem that we're facing at the moment.
Okay. Thank you. We have a couple of, I think, Maryland specific questions that came up in the chat. And so while we have you here, I want to make sure we honor that. One, I don't know, I think Samuel Statland asked a question, which I asked what date the county redistricting commissions could expect completed data to finish their redistricting. And I'm assuming that's a Maryland specific question.
I would imagine it is. It's a question we've gotten often. And so we will do it as quickly as we possibly can. If the Census Bureau delivers on the August 16th date for the release of the census data, then we're trying to remind people that we will have it available to you by September 1st, given that last couple of weeks in August to do the reallocation and the vendor doing its piece, and then the data center checking the vendor's work, and then basically making it available by September 1st. We will condense that process as far as we possibly can, but I don't want to give you any promise that you'll definitely have it by the 29th or the 26th of August. It's possible, but we've been trying to stick more or less to a September 1st kind of a date that we'll be able to, because we've actually talked to the vendor about the possibility of like, would they accept a premium to put Maryland first in the line? But we're one of 10 states now, and if we were one of the small ones, potentially maybe they would, but they will do it as quickly as they possibly can, as what we're being told. You can't pay for the Disney Fast Pass and get ours done first. Yeah. And we can't say that we will be able to violate the contract that we have with them that gives them 2 to 3 weeks to do the reallocation process. So if it takes them that long, it takes them that long. We will do our part as quickly as we possibly can and try to beat that. We are expecting to be able to publish that by September 1st.
And I know there was a question about, along those lines of, trying to a limited number of vendors, who can do this. There was a question about the vendors out there that are doing this work. And I believe Maryland's working with Caliper.
Yes, we're working with Caliper. And we worked with Caliper before, and the General Assembly was comfortable with Caliper also. So we as the executive branch pursuing a process that is the support, that includes the support of an independent commission, that's a governor's commission, and the General Assembly not being of the same party of the governor, we are literally in the I'm going to kind of a demilitarized zone. We are not making our processes political at this point. And I said before on calls that we agreeing on the same sort of vendor and having disputes about policy are what we're aiming to have the disputes be about policy and not be about data. So that's what I would warn any state that's going through any process that had any semblance of divided government, where where either the House and Senate are different parties, or the governor's mansion is a different party than the House and the Senate, or any of those processes. My goal is to have disputes based on policy and not based on data, so that if your software vendor generally tends to pull down the middle of the street and take everybody on the right-hand side of the street, and someone's using a vendor where you draw the line down the middle of the street and it's automatically taking each address on each side of the street, then that's a very kind of crude example, but we should have arguments based on policy and not based on data differences. So we're trying to eliminate data differences and arguments about data. So we try to proactively work together, and we're working together very fine. One of the Department of Legislative Services people is one of the foremost experts on this process. And so we have touch-based meetings with Department of Legislative Services that we will understand the data is what the data is. We can argue policy all the time, but let's not argue about the quality of the data. So let's try to make sure that our focus is getting good data, and we can argue policy about where a line should be or why a line should be, but it shouldn't be we have different data underlying our policy arguments. So that's one lesson from going through the situation that we're going through in Maryland at the time. So let's make the arguments on policy, not on data.
Thanks. And I think like we are right at time. That was really helpful. Appreciate it. Alex, if you know of other vendors, maybe you could type them in the chat for folks who are interested, that are out there providing states with assistance on this. But I'll turn it back over to Keisha. And thanks to both of you for being here today.
Yes. Again, big thanks, Secretary McCord and Alex, for being here. I think that folks found this conversation extremely useful. It's not many times we get to have a webinar where we can get into the weeds of geocoding and reallocations. And so I super appreciate both of you all's expertise and the expertise of your staff to be able to come on here for an hour and talk about this really important issue with all of us. And I really think that, the crux of this conversation is that, we all believe that representation is important, and that people that are currently incarcerated should be represented at their place, at their home communities. And so that is why we are here today to discuss how to do this process, especially in the midst of so many states passing reform. And if you are not a state that has passed reform, there are definitely ways to do this at the local level as well. Or even at the decision-making level at the state level as well. So please, you've heard from Alex. Common Cause is also working on this issue, but please feel free to reach out to folks. And I'll just stop right there and just say thank you all, and thank you so much for being here.
And a reminder about the activist training on Thursday too, for folks. And I know there were a couple questions about how Maryland got their reform passed, and we didn't quite get to that, but Thursday's webinar will get more into those kinds of advocacy strategies.
Absolutely. We will send a follow-up email with that link to that activist training as well. So again, thank you all so much, and see you guys next time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.